that's a salutary, I think, request. Yeah. And across the disciplines, I mean, it's so valuable and so useful, but challenging. Yeah. Hi. Good. How are you?
So I'm gonna take you.
Are you the person who updated my?
Yes, I do.
Thank you so much. I felt terrible asking you to do
That's
that.
fine. It's something we expect all the time.
Well, I really appreciate it.
So when he introduces you, you'll see your screen.
Okay.
Okay, we're ready to get started. We're ready to get started. Joel? Let's try to, we're trying to stay on schedule in part out of respect for people who might be taking seriously our agenda for the purposes of the live stream. So it is a great pleasure to introduce Lesley Larkin, Professor Lesley Larkin from Northern Michigan University, where she teaches in the English department. Professor Larkin's areas of expertise include African American literature, American ethnic literatures, race and gender studies, and the intersections among science, literature, and medicine. Her current book project is tentatively titled Reading in the Post-Genomic Age, where she's exploring how contemporary US and Canadian narratives engage re-articulations of race, gender, and humanness that are prompted by genomic research. So thank you very much for coming, Professor Larkin.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me. I'm really honored to be here and to speak among so many esteemed scholars, so many of whose work I've read in the course of developing this project. And one of the most exciting things for me about this conference is the opportunity to think about my current project in the terms of the good biocitizen, which I think is a wonderfully ambiguous and contested term. What I'm going to do is talk a little bit about that term and a companion term that I would call the good bionarrative citizen. Then I'll introduce a kind of overview of my current research project, and I'll end by talking briefly about 4 exemplary texts that I'm looking at in reading in the post-genomic age. So, what is meant by the good biocitizen? Is this the docile subject of biopower? And I immediately feel a little chastened by Dr. Koopman's presentation because I've gone immediately to the underside, the underbelly of biopower in these slides. But one way we might think about the good biocitizen is the docile subject of biopower, of the techniques for achieving subjugation of bodies and the control of populations. Is the good biocitizen the subject of biomedicine? A consumer responsible for pursuing individual health and well-being, perhaps even physical perfection? Is it a subject who donates, and I hope you can hear the scare quotes around donates, medical information or biological material from their own bodies for the public good? Perhaps the good biocitizen is a subject defined by genome-based affiliations that transcend state-based conferral of citizenship. And along with it, possibly kinship arrangements, maybe even those captured under the figure of race, a subject who, in other words, might help usher in a different kind of social organization, one that could slough off old structures of belonging tainted by racism and sexism. And these are all ideas about the good biocitizen that are contemporaneous with this genomic and post-genomic moment. And I hope it's clear from the slides that I've shown that I'm somewhat skeptical of some of these formulations, shadowed as they are by the underbelly of biopower. Alternatively, the good biocitizen might be a resistant subject who recognizes the continuities between old and new forms of biopower, who rejects the utopian notion that genomics would automatically lead to a post-racial or otherwise egalitarian society. A resistant biocitizen might be one that recognizes the embeddedness of human beings in complex biological and social and political environments, rejects human exceptionalism, and takes part in collective responsibility for trans species well-being at the local and planetary levels. And this is the Cuban-American performance artist Carmelita Tropicana, one of whose plays I'll talk about near the end of my presentation, and one of her quotes that recurs in several of her performances. I am good with the tongue. As a literary scholar, I'm interested in the stories we tell ourselves about what makes a good or a bad biocitizen, and even more to the point, how stories produce good or bad biocitizens. I'm curious about this on the level of representation. So what models of biocitizenship are proffered by literary works? But I'm also interested in the kinds of subjects such literary works help to produce outside their pages. So if we think about narrative citizens, we're thinking not just about characters within text, but also readers of texts. Reading can produce docile and resistant bionarrative citizens. So for my purposes, the term bionarrative citizen captures the idea that we are produced as subjects through stories about our biological being, about our bodies and our relationships to other bodies. Which stories are told, by whom, and to whom have significant impact on our lived experience. And this is why prohibition and coercion of literacy has historically been a significant expression of biopower. Bionarrative citizen also suggests our agency as embodied subjects of stories, as material semiotic subjects, to paraphrase eco-critic Stacy Alaimo. Reading from this perspective involves responsibility within complex narrative and physical networks. And this notion of reading is one that I find recurs in contemporary narratives about genomics. These are texts that take reading, a term that resonates in literary criticism and molecular biology, as a site for sustained ethical inquiry, as a site for asking the question, what or where is the good bionarrative citizen? Okay, so this next part is a bit of an origin story for my project. A few years ago, this book, Rebecca Skloot's The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks, probably many or most of you have read, was chosen on my campus for a Common Reader program, and I became interested in this text. It's a popular work of narrative nonfiction that intertwines three narratives. The story of the HeLa cell line, the first so-called immortal human cell line, the story of Henrietta Lacks, whose cancer cells were used to develop that cell line, and the story of the author of this text tracking down the Lacks story and developing it. And I was fascinated by the structure of the book and also by Skloot's desire to write what she called a biography of the cells and the woman behind the cells, a phrase that seems to revise what is meant by life writing. Skloot's book is at once a collaborative biography, a memoir, and a social history that raises important questions about the ethics of medical and literary practice. And it was this last overlap that fascinated me the most. I was in the middle at that time of a project, a monograph on African American literature and ideas about responsible reading. And it seemed that Skloot's book modeled and solicited various reading practices, some problematic, some promising. I recognized the effectiveness of Skloot's storytelling, but I was also haunted by the words of David Lacks, Henrietta's son, whom I interviewed in 2013. Although he expressed gratitude toward Skloot, he also expressed discomfort with his family's loss of privacy. And referring to a passage in the book in which Skloot describes Henrietta Lacks examining her cervix in the bathroom, he asked, "How could Rebecca know what my mother was doing behind closed doors?" And prompted by this question, I started to wonder about how the medical ethics question that Skloot's book brought to the fore, who can study whose body parts for whose benefit, might also relate to questions of narrative ethics. Who can tell whose story to whom? And so I started looking for contemporaneous narratives between 1990 and the present that might engage the same ethical overlap, and it turns out that there are many. And since then, other questions have opened up for me. Some of these include, how might the concept of DNA as genetic script inform the interpretation of life writing? How does contemporary biomedicine make demands on patients as consumers to manage genetic and other forms of risk? And how do these demands shape the literary marketplace in which narratives about health and medicine are tremendously popular, possibly as technologies for learning to manage one's own health within a biomedical model? How do challenges to biocolonialism and medical disparity, exploitation, and abuse circulate in specific literary tropes and forms? The vampire, for example, is one that recurs. How do genomic and post-genomic rearticulations of race influence literary representations of racialization? And how might they also complicate the social constructionist model of race that's preeminent in the humanities? How do the health humanities offer insights to literary scholars about our own discipline? How do practices of literary speculation, inspired by genomic research, not only imagine futures to be avoided, but also comment on present and ongoing social nightmares? And then a new question, what or where is the good bionarrative citizen? My primary argument is that many post-genomic literary works, and I've got a sort of gloss on post-genomics here, take genomic science not only as an object of critique, so this isn't just about writers intervening in genomics, but they also take genomics as an occasion for addressing ethical questions in the fields of literature and literary criticism. Many contemporary literary works which take the life sciences as a key object of interest are equally concerned with the politics and practices of reading. Such works perform critical rereadings not only of genomics, but also of reading itself. It's been widely acknowledged, if unevenly executed, that humanists and social scientists are crucial to responsible genomic research and its applications. Less attention, however, is paid to the value of such exchanges for the humanities. And so a secondary argument I would make is that interdisciplinary exchange between the sciences and the humanities should not be unidirectional. And I think recent work in the health humanities is valuable for thinking through this point. Rita Sharon, for example, has argued not only that attention to narrative improves medical care, but also that biological concepts drawn from science and medicine are useful for reorienting us to reading and writing as embodied acts of intersubjectivity. And one of her key metaphors, the cell membrane, is especially apt for my project. Sharon claims that stories set off a chain of reactions that reverberate on multiple levels: personal, medical, social, political, just as when a receptor on a cell's surface connects for the molecule for which it is primed. These reverberations enjoin narrative participants to certain ethical responsibilities. So I've got a quote on the screen from Priscilla Wald and Jay Clayton, who are literary scholars, who articulate a more common argument, I think, about what literature can bring to genomics, which is that there's certain practices of reading and interpretation that are salutary for genomics and other life sciences. And I think that's quite right and important. But the other side of this argument, I think, is that the other side of the question is, what comes back to literary criticism from these exchanges? That exchanges between the humanities and the life sciences might prompt meditations on reading is implied by the textual metaphors with which genomic discourse is replete. As Evelyn Fox Keller and Lily Kay have explained, terms like translation and transcription and vocabulary and so on made their way to biology through structural linguistics and informatics. And the ascension of the genome depended in part upon appeals to textual authority. Molecular genetics' adoption of textual metaphors has influenced the direction taken by the life sciences, and as those metaphors circulate, they also influence the direction taken by contemporary literature. A third argument, then, is that figurations of reading are doubly resonant in genomic-era literary works, referring at once to the fields of biology and literature. And at stake in this mutual imbrication is the development of interpretive practices attentive to homologous ethical issues. In many post-genomic literary works, reader agency, authorial responsibility, editorial influence, and the commodification of literature are intertwined thematically with agency and of patients and research subjects, researcher and doctor responsibility, corporate influence, and the commodification of DNA. Through this intertwining, such works offer strategies for reading the social language of DNA, modeling critical practices that resist commodification, as well as the reinscription of race and gender on genomic terms. These are works that find in the ethical conundrums of the post-genomic era opportunities for staging the conundrums of postmodern storytelling, for attending to the multivalent meaning of textual metaphors after the genome, and for resisting reductive modes of reading that focus on codes and the text itself at the expense of context. In other words, this is a post-genomic critical practice that such texts promote. It's worth noting that critical practices that focused on the text itself at the expense of context began to become dominant in American literary scholarship during the middle of the last century, at the same time that informatics and molecular genetics were developing. And at the same time that molecular genetics began to overshadow the study of cells, organisms, and somatic development, American literary criticism turned away from biography, history, and politics. The post-genomic turn, more recently, echoes the earlier post-structuralist turn in literary criticism by returning attention to the contingency of meaning. As Lily Kay has written, DNA is just as polysemic as poetry, and just as context-dependent. Contemporary literary criticism is beginning to expand the notion of context to include not only the social and political, but also the biological and chemical and geological, a move that's necessarily interdisciplinary. So implicit in my argument that the humanities really can't go it alone in developing these new critical practices is the idea that the humanities, like the sciences, are not always humane. And indeed, by centering the figure of the human, the humanities are premised on historical and ongoing practices of othering. In his recent book, Nothing Ever Dies, literary scholar and novelist Viet Thanh Nguyen argues that the term inhumanities is a more responsible name for the unwieldy field usually called the humanities. And Nguyen asserts a humanism expanded not only by the inclusion of new groups of others, a process that he says is always premised on producing still other others, but by the recognition of humanism's constitutive contradictions and disavowals. Many post-genomic literary works, I argue, don't take the human or the text or reading for granted. These are works that insist upon the complex interimplication of texts, bodies, and environments. And I'll briefly introduce 4 such texts now, beginning with The Immortal Life, which I would argue rather, despite itself, illustrates ethical questions that overlap the fields of medicine and literature. Then a novel by Richard Powers called Generosity and Enhancement, which grapples explicitly with medical and narrative ethics. I then turn to another novel by Ruth Ozeki called All Over Creation, which challenges gene fetishism through critical engagement of genomics textual metaphor. And finally, time permitting, I'll get back to Carmelita Tropicana, who we saw a slide of earlier, in her play Chicas, 2000. Through these readings, I will gesture toward a critical practice that I'm tentatively calling TRANS-CORPOREAL reading, a term I'm borrowing from Stacy Alaimo, which is inspired also by contemporary research in the life sciences and is attentive to the production of literary and biological meaning in complex contexts of material and semiotic exchange. Okay. It might seem odd to begin with The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks, in as much as this is a book that focuses on cells, not DNA. However, important developments in cell biology, in which HeLa played a key role, prefigured those in genomics and were met with similar public fascination. Furthermore, post-genomic science evinces a renewed concern with DNA's overlaying environments, beginning with cells themselves. And the ethical debates regarding the collection, reproduction, and commodification of cells of biological material applies both to cell lines and to genetic code. Indeed, as Margaret Locke points out, immortal cell lines and genetic databases are intertwined technologies. From a post-genomic vantage, I would say Gila is imbued with some of the significance of DNA, and the social life of DNA, to borrow Alondra Nelson's phrase, is inflected by the story of Gila. Not incidentally, last year, a family rift regarding who could speak for the Laxes and who could be paid for such speech resulted in DNA tests to confirm parentage. And that competing definitions of family and conflict over the commodification of the Lax story should be resolved by genetic testing techniques that might not exist without the development of the Gila cell line itself, I think neatly captures the thoroughgoing inter-implication of flesh, story, and capital in the post-genomic age. And I'm thinking here also of Kaushik Rajan's work on biocapital. The Immortal Life attempts to redress the erasure and misrepresentation to which Gila and its human source have been subjected, and acknowledges the history of racialized exploitation and abuse that frames this story. But despite these efforts, the Immortal Life, like the story it tells, is also an instance of appropriation that alters the life of a Black family in service of public goods that are unevenly distributed. Like her cancer cells, Henrietta Lacks' story has been collected by a well-meaning outsider and transformed into a marketable product. Skloot's book is necessarily burdened with the ethical complications that attend collaborative autobiographies, and it recalls the fraught publication histories, slave narratives, and abolitionist writing. In other words, it reveals extensive overlap between narrative and medical exploitation. I've skipped ahead too fast. I think problematically, The Immortal Life also subtly encourages its audience to pursue narrative content, even when faced with unwilling Black subjects. And if you've read the book, you may remember all of these scenes when Skloot is recounting how relentlessly she pursued this story, how many phone calls she had to make to the Lax family, how much effort she put in to overcoming resistance on the part of family members for the good of bringing this story to public attention. But there's an ethical question there, right? Skloot stalks the story and the people who live it, some of whom resist narrative plunder because of the history of medical plunder that Skloot recounts. And the afterword to the book, I think, makes plain that the stakes of The Immortal Life at least subtly favor concerns of readers with regular access to medical care, as they're encouraged to use this story to shore up their own medical autonomy, as readers are encouraged in that way. So there are some structural problems, I think, there. However, The Immortal Life also contains within its pages a disruptive counter-script. Henrietta's daughter, Deborah Lax, both aids and resists Skloot's efforts, and Skloot recounts that resistance. Also stepping into the tradition of Black characters who pursue literacy as a step towards self-realization, Deborah tracks down and reads documents and textbooks and performs internet searches and prints out reams of paper on HeLa cells and all sorts of other extraneous topics. Skloot attempts to correct Deborah's research methods, what we might call her wayward reading, but its contrapuntal potential remains in the text, and this is to Skloot's credit, it's recorded there. This potential is evident, for example, in the many reference for HeLa introduced by Deborah's online search. So when she types HELA into Google search, she gets all kinds of interesting things. This proliferation of meanings emphasizes linguistic waywardness at odds with deterministic interpretations of DNA. And although the information dump Deborah prints out is, like so-called junk DNA, apparently meaningless, Deborah nevertheless makes a meaningful association when she discovers that HeLa is also the name of a comic book character, a 7-foot-tall, half-black, half-white goddess who's part dead and part alive, and who seems to describe HeLa cells and Henrietta Lacks herself from Deborah's perspective. This version of HeLa challenges official readings of HeLa cells infected by racism and sexism, and represents the possibility for Black women to control their own stories. Okay, so that's the first exemplary text. The second I'd like to talk about is Richard Powers' 2009 novel Generosity and Enhancement. And like The Immortal Life, this is a narrative about a white writer of narrative nonfiction whose success depends partly upon the exploitation of marginalized people. Powers makes this ethical problem the centerpiece of his book, drawing an overt thematic parallel between narrative and medical exploitation. Further, his use of metafictional techniques of writing about writing invites readers to question the practice of text-centric analysis or close reading as a path to objective truth, whether scientific or literary. While Skloot reifies both science and literature as enterprises that are inadvertently rather than constitutively shaped by power relations, Powers implies that no matter how close you look at a story or a cell or genes, you cannot look past race, gender, or other social contexts. Generosity is focused on a character called Russell Stone. He's an adjunct writing instructor. Actually, adjunct writing instructors show up in a lot of these narratives. And there's something there about the higher education as an institution and power structures that I've not yet explored, but I think it's worth exploring. Stone was once a rising literary star. However, he's given up writing after having been accused of exploiting the subjects of his stories, including a Tohono O'odham man who attempts suicide after Stone's story about him is published. He's consumed with guilt when he meets Tassadi Amzwar, a Berber Algerian woman traumatized by war, but nevertheless who exhibits preternatural cheerfulness or hyperthymia. And Stone is intensely attracted to her happiness. His obsession with her sets in motion a series of events that leads Tassa to attempt suicide. And although Stone feels guilty about his role in her downfall, he also feels betrayed by Tassa's revelation that the stories she wrote for his class were more creative than nonfiction. Stone's hunger for the truth recalls Skloot's obsession with the lax story, and in the post-genomic era, this drive for authenticity necessarily goes molecular. Stone's interest in Tassa culminates in a close look at her DNA by way of a genetic study led by Thomas Curtin. I think the name is really interesting. Thomas, I think, suggesting doubt, and Curtin suggesting the veiling of truth. Having given up pure research in favor of private funding and patents, Curtin embodies the threat of genomic capitalism. Like Stone, Curtin also feels betrayed when Tassa's suicide attempt belies her genetic predisposition to happiness. So by aligning Stone and Curtin, Powers aligns genomic and literary exploitation, and through metafictional technique suggests that every attempt at close reading is in fact self-reflexive rather than objective. It's about the reader rather than the text. Like Skloot, Generosity's narrator tells Stone and Curtin's story while also telling the crafting of the story, a structure that implies there's no telling that's not also a retelling, and no reading that's not also a rereading, and that both rely on theft, which the narrator describes as the secret of all imagination. Revision is the novel's outstanding theme. Stone is also an editor, and as a teacher, he likes to repeat the truism, all writing is rewriting. It's also evident in Curtin, the scientist's championing of transgenics and gene therapy, which are kinds of genetic editing. Revision is also evident in the narrator's abundant calls to look closer or look again, in direct allusion to the practice of close reading, a practice that can never get close enough. And this is the part of the novel's opening passage, which is quite dizzying. Here, Powers writes a narrator who writes a character who is rewriting a lesson plan that he has largely plagiarized from a book on writing and from which the narrator is now plagiarizing. Throughout the scene, the narrator repeats the phrases "look again" and "look harder" as he engages in a cycle of reading, copying, describing, revising, inventing, the same cycle in which Stone is engaged. Importantly, the narrator's imperative statements also grammatically implicate the novel's readers, who, like the narrator, cannot be guiltless observers. That's Powers' phrase. Powers' critique of close reading applies to writing and scientific research. So Dr. Curtin has been waiting to fill in a single point on a graph tracing the distribution of allelic variations influencing emotional well-being before publishing his research. He's waiting for that one final dot. His discovery of Tassa fulfills both scientific and narrative desire. You know what the lab will have to discover, the narrator insists. And the use of the second person, that you, again implicates both narrator and reader in the story of Tassa's reduction to genetic profile. At the end of the novel, Tassa speaks against this reduction by alluding to the material and political contexts that structure her life, specifically violence in Algeria. Tell them my genes had no cure, that this place couldn't break, she says. Presenting literature as an important site for negotiating what Jenny Reardon calls the co-production of science and culture, Generosity opposes the naive belief that stories or DNA can be read outside of material reality and ideology. Okay, the third exemplary text, All Over Creation, a novel, again by Ruth Ozeki. This novel goes even further than Powers by evoking Genomic's textual metaphor in order to articulate an ethic of transcorporeality, Stacy Alimo's term for the mutual permeability and interconnectedness of the human and more than human world. Ozeki's novel focuses on Yumi Fuller, an adjunct English professor, who has returned to her parents' Idaho farm. Although the novel critiques corporate monoculture, it also insists that ethics on the ground are muddy. In All Over Creation, potatoes make strange bedfellows, as anarcho-feminist hippies join forces with conservative Christian farmers and war veterans, and as Yumi's traditional father rails passionately against abortion, racism, and transgenics. This ideological promiscuity, to borrow a favored term of Ozeki's, echoes in the linguistic promiscuity that permeates the text. Ozeki's frequent language games by which words recombine semantically and syntactically are linked to genetic recombination. Take, for example, the labels Lloyd affixes to everyday objects for the benefit of his dementia-stricken wife, Momoko. Lloyd's grandson goes around the house rearranging these labels, externalizing the severed link between word and meaning in Momoko's mind, but also exposing linguistic contingency and recalling the spelling mistakes that result in genetic mutations. The chaos implied by linguistic and biological diversity is countered by the foreclosure of meaning that monolingualism, like monoculture, ensures. So as an example, Yumi's Japanese name is frequently mispronounced in her rural Idaho town as Yummy, a mispronunciation that contributes to the Orientalist objectification that she experiences and sexual violence that is part of that. Misnaming reaches absurdist heights in the case of Melvin, an activist who goes by the letter Y. And here's what happens when Y introduces himself to people. I'm Y, Frankie hears I'm WHY. He couldn't answer that Y. Why's my name? Why's his name what? You know, Y like the letter, like the chromosome. In this direct evocation of the textual metaphor, Ozeki implies that the genomic script is semantically unstable, even in the case of the supposedly sex-determining Y chromosome, to which Melvin appeals as a means of foreclosing ambiguity. In these passages, Ozeki associates linguistic combination with genetic recombination by way of sexual reproduction, a promiscuous practice distinguished from both Lloyd's monocultural cloning of potatoes and Momoko's careful hand pollination of diverse plants. In both practices, the product of generations of admixture is fixed by human intervention, in striking resemblance to the fixing of geographical populations at a particular point in the history of human migration for the purposes of genetic ancestry testing or the diversification of gene banks. Even the Burbank potato, exemplar of agricultural monoculture, has resulted from centuries of cross-pollination, human migration, and plant mutation. And here is a quote that I think captures the sort of trans-corporeal ethic that the novel articulates. Ozeki challenges the textual analogy that underwrites gene fetishism. The novel refuses genetic reductionism and religious fundamentalism, both practices that involve context-free reading. So I have one more example, but I realize I've run out of time. So if folks are interested in this play, I can talk a little bit about it in the Q&A. Interestingly, this play includes a similar sort of who's on first exchange that I've put here that involves 3 pronunciations and reference for the term dolly. And is in reference to cloning. This is a play that does many of the same things as Ozeki's novel, but also goes in a different direction by insisting it's a futuristic play. It's set in the future. It's a kind of dystopia. But the way this dystopia works structurally in the play is to ask audience members, readers, to focus their critical attention back on the present moment. So it's a presentist, futuristic play. Okay, a quick conclusion. I'll close by returning to Gila, the immortal cells at the center of Rebecca Skloot's The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks. Like any eukaryotic cell, Gila contains a genetic script in its nucleus. This script, the cell's DNA, is understood to determine morphology, what we might call the meaning of DNA. However, the development of an organism involves the complex interaction of genes and environments. Epigenetics reveals that the same genetic script can produce different meanings depending on complex environmental factors. And the literary works that I've discussed today echo these insights in their understanding that literary meaning also results from complex and unpredictable exchanges among a literary script, its environments, and various agents. The wayward, self-reflexive, intersubjective, and trans-corporeal reading practices these works invite are practices that promote a critical biocitizenship for the post-genomic age. Thank you.
Thank you. I really enjoyed the talk.
Thank you.
Nice, analysis of a variety of different kinds of texts, all of which I have questions about. But I'm just really interested to know, going back to the Rebecca Skloot case. I mean, since you're a way of looking at this. Since you're trained to read the book in a way that I never really felt like I, could analyze it properly, but I was really struck by what you noted, which is how, and also that Ezekiel, her son, noted that, how did you know what was going on in this room? Do you know if, I just thought it was really amazing that she could write the book. Do you know if anyone has ever asked her about this? And what would she say? Like, you know about these forms and about these genres, et cetera. I know there's a whole history of this, but not quite like this. I can't think of another example quite like this. One that's, I guess I just don't know how she can get away with it, and she's been sort of held accountable for it. And has anybody asked her about it? And I wonder what she would say.
Yeah, I've seen her. I think she gets asked this question a lot because yeah, I think she has been asked this ethical question a lot, and I think her answer has mostly been expressed in a couple of different ways. One, it was crucial that this story was told, and efforts had been made to tell it, but those efforts had not become as widespread, and she was committed to putting flesh on those cells, making Henrietta a human again in the popular imagination, and that was her goal, and she did that, and she was committed to doing that in dialogue with the family. And so, that was an interesting moment when I was talking to David Lacks, because they had, at that time, I don't think this is happening so much anymore, but at that time they were touring around a lot together, the family, members of the family and Rebecca. I think that is happening less now, but they were involved in this really together, and there was a sort of presentation of that mutuality at the center of things. But this interview, she was not present, and he said that. So, I think her answer has been, I worked with the family, I attempted to represent their voices accurately. She talks a little bit about this in the preface to the book too. I made the choice to try to represent people talking the way that they talk. I did not edit or alter the way that they speak. I tried to be authentic and representative, and to do this in dialogue with the family, and that's sort of where she's ended it. There is also some meditation on her whiteness in the preface to the book, but it's very brief. She talks about growing up in a homogeneous community and not having much exposure to issues of race and racism, and how the project that resulted in this book was her way of learning about those issues that she'd not learned about before. But I do, at the times that I've seen her respond to that question, it's been sort of shut down pretty quickly. Like, this is a story that needed to be told. I worked with the family. I tried to do it ethically.
I mean, that's the story about the story, which is a very simple story. And it doesn't really get at the complexities of the power relationships there. What does it mean to really be working in, working with the family? And then there's the whole thing about the foundation she set up and who got to oversee that money. And so there's money on the line here. How does that complicate what, it means to really work with people? Yeah, so it just seems like one could write a whole story about the story.
Yes.
I know you're writing some about it, and others have commented on this. But it seems like it's worth unpacking this because it's been a powerful text.
Yes.
So.
Yes, and the fact that it's been so powerful is so in line with, for example, abolitionist texts in the 19th century. And what were the most successful abolitionist texts? Those were the texts that presented sympathetic characters that would be the most sympathetic to white audiences and often had a kind of white go-between, right? So there's a long history that this text fits into, yeah.
I'd love to ask a question, but I'd first love to hear from other people who haven't yet had a chance to ask a question. No takers? Okay. Thank you very much. I wonder if you could tell us even more about what trans-corporeal reading inspired by the sciences means, looks like. I'm kind of asking of you to do what I was asking of Colin. I hear there's a positive message here, and actually there's a way in which it kind of might even resemble the one I thought I heard from Colin. I heard from Colin at the end, and he's here to correct me if I'm wrong, say something like, look, I don't want to dispute the fact that there is this genomic text here that is in some sense real, true if you like, and it's important for us in the humanities to recognize that, and it's important for people in the sciences to recognize that it's up to us to make something of that text. That is, to my mind, a very congenial way of thinking about things, and I'd like to know what you're thinking, what the positive message is.
Yes. I was really hoping that this audience would help me figure out what I mean by trans-corporeal reading, because this is a concept that I'm still working out. And there was a time in the development of this project that I was calling it epigenetic reading. Now I've sort of moved over to this term, and so this is in flux for me. But I'm thinking about this term in relation to larger conversations within literary criticism about what it means to read with consciousness about material contexts. So I mentioned at some point in this talk that recently many literary critics have been turning to the material and asking, how does what we do actually relate to or impact the material world? What does it mean to read with a kind of awareness and consciousness of material environmental conditions, for example? And so material eco-criticism is the best known vein of this sort of thinking. And some of that is a response to what is sometimes described as like the theory era in literary criticism, which in maybe its caricatured version was nothing but language games and abstractions. And there's a kind of resistance and pushback against that now to think about the material. So what does it mean to read materially? And in my previous book, in which I was looking at 20th century African American literature and ideas about reading and how to read ethically and responsibly, I was quite focused on how those texts asked readers to be conscious of social and political context. So for example, to be thinking about the institutions in which you're reading, who are you reading alongside, who's not present at any given scene of reading, those sorts of questions. And I think now the direction that my work has gone in is asking me to move beyond just the social and political into the realm of the material. So what are the embodied experiences of reading, or what are the embodied effects of certain readings and the promotion of certain reading subjects How do we think materially about the reverberations of readings? How do they affect people in networks? That are not just that are material in the sense of sociopolitical, but also material in the sense of physical. It's a kind of deepening of that sense of responsibility and an awareness that those networks of power are being enacted on real physical bodies. I think that's the direction in which I'm going. And there's a kind of deeper sense of responsibility to one another as human beings, but also to other species and to the environment. And so if we really believe as literary critics, those of us who are literary critics, if we really believe that literature can do something in the world, what are the possible effects that any given text and any given reading of a text could actually have on that world? So eco-critics, for example, are asking all the time how best to communicate about environmental issues to a popular audience to get people to act, right? I'm interested in how these narratives might train readers to read critically, not just other literary texts, but a whole landscape of texts that take genomics and genetic information as a kind of given, right? So that was not the most direct answer to your question, but those are the things that I'm thinking about. And I think that term trans-corporeal posits a deeper sort of sense of responsibility, and it's also not limited to responsibility that humans have to one another.
Takers? Because I could keep asking questions.
This is the last one, and it'll have to be super quick.
It was a rambling sort of a one. So I'm from New Zealand, and some of your discussion about kind of co-production of narratives reminded me of a debate around Indigenous data sovereignty that we're having in New Zealand at the moment, and also in Canada and Australia and other places. And so one of the ways that's playing out in New Zealand is this kind of debate between the state saying we need data about our Māori Indigenous population in order to do good. The story has to be told, right? We need to understand about marginalisation and disenfranchisement, and we need to do better in terms of how we serve you. And then some pushback from Māori activists saying, we're sick of you telling the narrative about us, and we're sick of this kind of theory of benefit sharing, to borrow the term from Genomics. Now we're interested in kind of advocating for a power sharing, co-production, co-design model where you don't get our data without our approval. And we can be involved in co-telling those narratives. So I just kind of wondered if you had any comment, about that example or other practical examples where you can see this kind of theory that you're talking about play out, I suppose, in these spaces.
Yeah, I think that's really important, and certainly the same thing is happening in the US context and globally. An interesting thread for me to follow in this project is to look comparatively at Indigenous writers and African American writers and the variation in approaches to that question. So, we're going to hear more about Alondra Nelson's work about African American lay genealogists and using genetic testing to create, to find an opportunity for kind of reparative relationship to an ancestry that had been robbed of that community, even though that's also in tension with the kind of reinscription of Blackness and other racial categories through both narrative representations, but also scientific research, and the fact that to get funding from the federal government to do research, you've got to use these racial categories, so that's getting reinscribed even when the stated goals for the researchers is to resist that. So on the one hand, you have that, and then in the Indigenous context, there's been a much more sustained critique and rejection of and opting out of those kinds of projects and demands for the kind of cooperative or autonomous sovereign model that you're talking about. So I mentioned the figure of the vampire, and that's one that I'm tracing in this project because it appears in both narratives by Indigenous and African American writers. And in fact, I'll be looking at one vampire novel by Octavia Butler called Fledgling, and thinking about how her use of that figure is distinct from the way that it circulates in indigenous resistance to the Human Genome Diversity Project and other even more overt instances of biocolonialism. So yeah, I think that's really important. And to follow those distinctions and in terms of different populations is really important. Mm-hmm. Thank you.